is Cold Start.
Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous lag, or to take arms among a sea of displacement, and by forcing induction, support them. To boost or not to boost? That is the question.
The other day I came to the realization that maybe the naturally aspirated engine is becoming a dying breed. I feel like this has happened slowly but surely over the last decade or so within the automotive industry, that every engine nowadays is either boosted, EV, hybrid, some sort of artificial add-on, right? Nowadays, if we look at, modern day sports cars, I think there's like what, 5 naturally aspirated cars left. We have the humble Mazda MX-5 that still has a naturally aspirated engine, the Toyota GR86, Subaru BRZ, the Ford Mustang, still naturally aspirated V8, the good old days. Same thing with the C8 Corvette, the lower ranks of the Z06 and the Stingray. The Lexus LC500, which maybe as enthusiasts we should care about now since it has one of these engines. And then finally, Porsche, of course, with their GT4s and GT3s as well. But fewer than I would have expected.
Yeah, there's not that many. Just trying to enumerate them myself, I wouldn't have even gotten all those ones that you mentioned. That's about it. I mean, if you look across the whole market of cars that are available today, everything on it says boosted or turbocharged or supercharged or, to your point, electrically enhanced in some way, hybrid. And why is that? I mean, is it something about the naturally aspirated engine that's no longer good enough? Well, it depends on how you evaluate that, right? And I think emissions is a huge part of what drives this, not just performance. So as enthusiasts, we live in a world that is full of all this stuff. It's full of pollution, and so people want to try to, curtail that from cars, and we understand that. But how much of that is being done for the purposes of efficiency? How much of that could actually benefit us in the performance realm? And what are the trade-offs that we make in these various technologies that exist around turbocharging, supercharging, electric turbos? All these things are sort of newish or newly developing technologies that are coming to the market, and we're seeing more and more cars employing these methods of forced induction of some form of boost to increase artificially the amount of displacement that an engine is doing.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point that you bring up is like there's a duality to this discussion, which is the industry by and large is turbocharging their cars, but then that's also creeping into the performance sector. Because like we think about adding turbos to something because we want to add power and that's going to make the car more fun. But we start looking at Econobox cars, humble little 4-cylinder commuters, and everything nowadays is a turbo 4-cylinder. The average car has a turbo now, and it's kind of, well, why is the industry going this way? Why is everything turbocharged? And should we care? As enthusiasts, losing out on naturally aspirated engines, is that something that we should be mad about? I mean, we're not going to change anything, but it's just, do we want to be on our porch shaking our fist to the sky of, get rid of my turbos or not, right? And so, like you were saying, manufacturers, they went the way of the turbocharger to get more power out of less, right? At keeping these engine sizes small, which helps with efficiency, fuel economy, stuff like that, but still being able to provide power to consumers when they want it, right? Within a turbocharged engine, if you stay out of boost, they're really efficient. And then when you get into boost, you have that power. And so there's the benefit of increased fuel economy, but at the expense of increased complexity and how these things are packaged.
Yeah, and it's not as if this is a novel concept. When we were talking about the Le Mans race of 1930 and the Mercedes entry, we told you about a supercharged engine. They've been doing this a long time. Turbocharging's a little bit newer in terms of the technology. They didn't start production turbocharging cars until the 60s. There was an Oldsmobile Jetfire and a Chevy Corvair Monza Spider that were among the first 2 production turbocharged cars. And then, of course, in the 70s, Porsche became famous for their 911 turbo, really probably the most notable and influential in terms of perpetuating turbo engines through the rest of the industry. So it's not like this is a new idea that we want to increase the amount of air that we're forcing into the engine to make the combustion process more efficient. But there is a difference here between making the process more efficient and making the air that exhausts from the engine more efficient or cleaner, right? And so turbos have been employed to reduce the actual size of an engine necessary to produce combustion. by allowing more forced air in other than what would be occurring naturally in the naturally aspirated engine, which results in a different profile in terms of the exhaust, right? So turbos are a way for cars to be more efficient and produce cleaner outcomes than they might otherwise. Is that something that's different about a turbo than a supercharger?
Yeah, so these systems, I mean, kind of like an overarching view of what we're talking about here, because we're using terminologies most people should be familiar with, but if you're not, naturally aspirated, just meaning that an engine is using the air that it can take in from the atmosphere. It's naturally just being added to the engine where boosting or forced induction, which comes in the form of superchargers, like you were talking about that old school Mercedes, as well as turbos that came a little bit later, they're trying to cram more air in. They're compressing air. And so if we can add more air into the engine, we can add more fuel to accompany that more air and create a bigger boom, which then creates more power. Now, there is a massive difference of a supercharger versus a turbo in the way that they delivered that compressed air. Now,
Right.
they do the same thing, right? They're compressing air, they're feeding it into the engine, but how it's actually compressing that air, slightly different. Like you're saying, turbos, albeit that they are more efficient, they're able to utilize that exhaust gas to be able to spin up their turbines and create that compressed air. They do have the byproduct, which is it takes time to create that exhaust gas from the engine to then build the boost, and that comes in a form of turbo lag. Now, before we get too deep into turbos, because there's a little bit more to talk about in regards to the advancements in technologies recently, and albeit turbos, by and large, are the most popular form to boost engines nowadays. Superchargers, although they are used, are less used in general manufactured cars, right? So superchargers, we'll start off with those first. Those ones, rather than using the exhaust gas from the engine to spin up a turbine to compress the air, they're usually belt driven, or in some cases, they have a drive shaft of some kind driven off the engine. So sometimes that's gear driven, sometimes that's chain driven, but it's using power from the engine
Oh, I
to
see.
spin a turbine to then compress the air.
So they're effectively a derivative of what's coming off the crankshaft. So you're robbing in a way the power of the engine to create more power?
Yes, so superchargers are considered parasitic,
Ah,
meaning they take horsepower from your engine to create the compressed air, which in turn should create more power.
right. And I always hear about the supercharger pulley, as that's the thing that is being used to dictate the boost level to the supercharger itself.
Yes, so in most common cases with supercharger, they're running off of the auxiliary belt. And so then there's a pulley on the supercharger that runs on that belt. So depending on the circumference of that pulley, it'll create a different gear ratio of how it spins the supercharger and how much boost it makes. Now, the main benefit to superchargers, because you might be thinking like, man, parasitic, that's not a good term to be using here. The main benefit of superchargers is it eliminates that lag. So basically, it doesn't have to wait for the engine to create an exhaust gas to
Mhm.
spin it up and build boost. As soon as the engine's turning, it's creating boost. So that means that you have low end boost being created, and that delivery is going to be very linear because as the engine starts to spin up in RPM, it's creating more boost along the way.
That's one of those things you hear people talk about with naturally aspirated engines is that the power delivery is more linear.
Yeah.
So what that means is when you step on the accelerator, the rate of acceleration that you see through the RPM band, right, isn't constant, right? You see fast acceleration, then it slows down a little bit, then it kind of tapers off. You notice how your RPM gauge will kind of slow down as it gets higher and higher as you go. This is a byproduct of that effectively. So the supercharger itself allows you to gain the benefit of that forced induction right off the bat versus
Yeah.
waiting for the engine to work enough to produce exhaust. So there's not waiting for that byproduct of the combustion cycle to drive this.
Right. It's all about either with the supercharger or the turbo, it's about being able to put more air into the engine at one time.
Right, right.
And if we can compress it and package it tighter, that means we can get more air into every stroke, which means we can add more fuel into that stroke, which means the boom is bigger, therefore we create more power. Now, with the superchargers, you also have more simplistic packaging. That's a benefit of superchargers. They're kind of more self-contained in regards to their cooling systems and things like that, where turbos get a little bit more complex. Now, superchargers also have less adjustability than turbos. Like you were talking about with that pulley, you kind of set your pulley and that's it, right? Like there's not this like can't go in and tune a supercharger as well as you can tune turbos in the way that it's delivering power to the engine. Even with turbos, which we'll get into, you can adjust how much boost each gear gives you with the turbo. You can tune all of this stuff in. So superchargers are less tunable. The biggest thing to consider here of like, what is the big benefit of superchargers versus turbos? Superchargers, it's mainly that linear throttle response that you get out of it.
Right.
But the biggest thing to keep in mind here is since superchargers are parasitic, you usually see superchargers on larger displacement engines because they need the power themselves
They can
to
afford it.
feed the supercharger to then feed the power back. So like for an example, like you wouldn't necessarily supercharge a Miata, and for all of us that are like tuners, this makes sense, right? You would turbo a Miata. You wouldn't
Totally.
supercharge it. And it's like, well, why? Well, a Miata doesn't make that much power to begin with, so you're going to have to rob a decent amount of horsepower from the naturally aspirated engine to feed the supercharger to then feed power back in. So like your
Oh,
general gain on a supercharged Miata motor might only be, 10 to 15 horsepower, but now you're adding so much more strain because the air being packed in is so much higher. So it's like it wouldn't make sense in that application. But for like a road going car that you can buy from a manufacturer, we all know Hellcats and like the old ZR1, those are supercharged cars that you can buy from factory. And those are large engines. Those are massive engines. And the biggest benefit that the manufacturer, Dodge, wanted in that case was just instant throttle response. Being a drag car, essentially, a supercharger is going to give you more of a punch off the line. Yes, I understand in turbo technology, they've developed, anti-lag and ways to build boost off the line to launch the cars better.
yeah.
But
Well,
back in the days, that used to be a harder challenge to be able to accomplish, where that supercharger, once again, gives you that instant boost.
yeah, so effectively it's proportionate in the amount of power that's being generated by the naturally aspirated plant, how much you can get out of that supercharger. So if you don't have that much displacement to start, by robbing some, you're going to take a lot away of what's there and you're not going to get that much of a gain. So that's why
Yeah.
it makes sense for cars like, let's say like the CT5V Blackwing Cadillac, right, which is rated at something like 668 horsepower. I think it's a 6-liter V8 engine. So plenty of displacement, plenty of opportunity there to borrow some power to make more. So that car is supercharged. That makes total sense. And to your
Yeah.
contrasting comparison, the Miata, small, tiny little engine, like 1.8-liter engine, you're not going to do a supercharger on that. You're going to look at a turbo potentially.
Right. And there's different types of superchargers, and usually we see superchargers predominantly on V8s, mainly because of the way that the intake is packaged on a V motor. Makes sense. You can have a top mounted supercharger. So that's going to be your Roots or your twin screw style supercharger,
Yeah.
which that's just how it's compressing the air. Whereas, say, like a centrifugal supercharger, that's going to be more like turbo style. It's going to look very turbo-esque, but still be belt driven. Those you're going to see like a Miata. There is a supercharger for Miatas. I don't know who's buying these, but that one is going to be a centrifugal. And then another great example of like cars that were supercharged or like you could buy supercharged kits for. Back to BMWs. I know, shoot me, BMW fan over here. But with the E36 M3, oddly enough, there was a supercharger kit that you could buy for the S52 motor from Dynon. It was a Dynon supercharger. Now, that was also a centrifugal style supercharger, belt driven off the auxiliary belt. And, you might be asking, well, like you're saying, if superchargers are mainly fit for V style engines, why would you have one for a straight six and a BMW application? And everyone's thinking BMWs nowadays, they're turboed. So, like, why wouldn't you turbo an S52? Well, once again, the mindset back then for Dynon was keeping this very linear power delivery that the S52 and those naturally aspirated BMWs are known for, and keeping that same style of power delivery, but just trying to up the horsepower a little bit. And so that's why a supercharger kit was offered for the S52, not necessarily a turbo.
Yeah, it makes total sense, right? So there's just sort of the nature of the engine might dictate the design, which makes the most sense for trying
Right.
to boost the power of this particular one.
Once again, there's supercharged cars out there. They're just not as popular as turbos. I think turbos nowadays have taken over the marketplace in regards to boosting engines.
Yeah, turbo seems to be definitely the front runner and has been for quite a long period of time, just based on the familiarity or awareness you have of seeing the badge on cars, if nothing else. And when turbos started coming out again, it was in the 60s, but really meaningfully in the 70s, these started being produced in mass numbers. And The problem with turbos early on, again, was that lag, which is you step on the throttle from a stop, and it takes time for the engine to produce combustion so that there are exhaust gases by which you can turn the turbine on the turbo. So there's this delay product where you get on the gas and nothing happens. You're like, wow, aren't turbos supposed to be faster? Well, yeah, with the boost, but until that boost can be generated, you're waiting. And in fact, you are also robbing from the exhaust gases from that engine, right? You're effectively trapping them to reuse them to spin this turbine. So until it's up to speed, right, you don't get the power. But then suddenly, once the turbine kicks in, whoosh, there's this boost of air that comes into the engine, this extra boost of power, and it's sudden. And when these were first being developed, they didn't have mechanisms or systems to sort of smooth out the power delivery. It was kind of like no power, boom, all of a sudden this blast of power. And it's one of the reasons that the rear-wheel drive 911 turbo of the mid-'70s, when those first started coming out, they called them the Widowmaker. Because what would happen was people would be driving this car that had all the weight out back, and the turbo would kick in all of a sudden in an unexpected way and would start to boost, and it would overwhelm their ability. Maybe they're going through a turn and it just put too much power through the car at that period in time so that they lost traction. Or the turbos would be boosting and the person would take their foot off the gas because they want to stop, and the turbos are still spinning. So there's residual power that's still being delivered to that car in a condition when you want to stop. And so it would create these circumstances by which you didn't really have complete control of the car in the way you would expect. Put your foot on the throttle to go, and you take your foot off the throttle to stop or press the brake. And the turbos sort of changed this behavior in the early form. So they weren't as popular with enthusiasts because we want to have power all throughout the power band. That all of a sudden light switch on power wasn't really what they were after. It was an exciting feeling. It was a thrill. The cars go fast once that kicks in, but they're a little out of control without some other mechanism for managing that.
Now, for those that may have not known how turbos worked, you might be thinking like, oh, this is pretty trick. Like, it's using exhaust, it's using a waste product of the engine to create more power. Like, that's pretty cool, right? So we're actually using the exhaust gases to now spin that turbine to then compress the air. So rather than like the supercharger, we're using a belt or some driven off the auxiliary of the motor, we're using these exhaust gases to like spin that turbine to then compress the air. Now with this adds additional complexity as well. So we have to route that exhaust gas to the turbo. There needs to be cooling for that compressed air going back into the engine. Turbos themselves need to be cooled. That's going to require oil to be able to do that. So there's all these additional piping that needs to go into a turbocharged engine. And so you can see in the early days when cars were originally turbocharged, there was a lot of extra stuff in the engine bay, which meant there was more stuff to go wrong. And, you know, turbo engines were seen as, yes, they were performance more so back in the day, but they didn't have the reliability of just a simplistic, naturally aspirated engine. Now, this has changed over time, right? I don't think that we nowadays look at a turbocharged engine and think like, oh, that's going to be an unreliable thing. Yes, it has additional complexity. Yes, there's additional things that can go wrong in a modern day turbo engine versus a naturally aspirated. But we figured out most of that stuff for the most part. And now also in the modern era, speaking of that turbo lag, there's been a lot to be done to eliminate the lag that you experience. And turbos don't have low-end boost. That's always been their downfall. Now there's been ways to kind of get around that. One of those things was using sequential turbos or, you know, twin turbos, but in a sense of there was a little turbo and a big turbo. So the little turbo, since it was smaller, could get spooled up with less exhaust gas, that lower RPM range. And then as that turbo would spool up, it would start spooling the bigger turbo. Then that bigger turbo would come in on the top end.
Oh, I see. It's overcoming the initial resistance of getting the turbine spinning. So we have a smaller one, so that's easier to get started, but that's going to produce less total power than a larger turbo. So we use that as sort of for the low speed stuff until we transition to the bigger turbo.
Exactly. So little turbo for lower RPM, bigger turbo for the larger RPM. And so then it would kind of smooth out that transition of feeding the boost into the power band. Now, advancing from this, because now sequential turbos, we're adding even further complexity of multiple turbos, multiple cooling systems,
Timing.
multiple, timing of feeding in that power. And so the biggest advancement that has happened, I would say, in the modern era, other than like turbos becoming much more efficient in the way that they can build boost, they can apply the power. Manufacturers have worked of how this feeds into the engine. But the biggest thing that actually has fascinated me in the modern era in regards to turbochargers is electric turbos, which you might be thinking like electric, boo, boo, electric, boo EVs. Well, with electric turbos, it's a little bit more interesting, I think. And there's two different types, which initially I thought there was only one, but there's actually two types of electronic turbos. One of them is a standalone electric motor driven air compressor.
Oh, interesting.
So it's its own thing separate from the mechanical turbo
So it compresses the air inside this other assembly
and feeds it to the engine,
already compressed.
and that fills in where the turbo can't build boost in the low RPM. So basically, an electric motor is building boost on the low end of the RPM range until the bigger turbo can take over, or the mechanical turbo can take over. Now, the other E-turbo, which has come out in Porsche's kind of like been the forefront of this technology, especially in sports cars. This one, it has an electric motor inside the turbo. So when there's not enough exhaust gas to spool up the turbo, low RPM, it engages this electrical motor to spin the turbine to compress air, make the turbo run until the exhaust gas builds up enough to then take over.
Interesting.
So it's internal into its one turbo, but now it can build boost at low RPM without the need for the exhaust gas. So like, and this is a weird way to think about this, but it's basically an electronic supercharger.
Yeah, it's an electronic supercharger and an energy recovery system combined.
Right. I mean, it's basically like an electronic supercharger in the way that it's not being driven by the exhaust gas. So it's like an E supercharger, then turbo takeover in one system. So like it's now stupid efficient in the way that it can build boost.
Right, and it just has its own motor that obviously takes other power to manage that, but it's separate from what the turbo is doing itself.
Right. So it's kind of an add-on. So now we have these hugely efficient turbos. We have hugely efficient turbocharged cars, which now this makes sense of as this technology is advanced and a lot of the drawbacks of turbos, the reliability issues, the power delivery issues have kind of been eliminated. So you can see why manufacturers are now using turbos, not only for the fuel efficiency benefit for their normal cars, but now in a performance sense. Why wouldn't you have your car turbocharged?
Yeah, it makes sense. And I guess there's the different approaches of compressing the air with that electronic turbo versus using it to force more air into the turbo where the compression is happening in that assembly. But ultimately, it's about packaging, right? And one of the things we said, superchargers were a little bit more elegantly packaged, sort of integrated to the intake, whereas the turbos are these additional assemblies. One of the things that's happened over time is those additional assemblies, their distance away from the other components, right? How far of the run is from the exhaust to the turbo? How far is it from the turbo to the intake, right? Those things were really important. So they developed this configuration they called a hot V turbo configuration. In a V-shaped engine, so like a V cylinder, V6, V8, the turbos would actually be physically located within that V, so like within the body of the engine. So the runs to and from the turbo are a lot shorter, and they would allow for a lot more efficient packaging.
Yeah, efficient packaging until all of a sudden something goes wrong and you have to replace a turbo. And where is that turbo located? Oh, in a very inefficient location.
Yeah, or turbo or turbos.
But that's a mechanics problem.
Well,
the engineers don't have to deal with that. But
send that over.
Now going into this of like, we've explained in a very light way the difference of superchargers, turbos, and why the industry has gone this way. Now, the biggest question I want to ask is, do we care as enthusiasts that the naturally aspirated engine is dying off? And is there a stake to put in the ground of like, I'm upset about this, but like, why? And what is the main differences of the non-turbo versus the turbo?
Yeah, in 2026, this is a very different conversation than it would have been in the past. I think a lot of our car enthusiast culture comes from things that used to be a certain way, and the idea and that overhang of turbos are maybe less attractive in some way than superchargers or naturally aspirated engines, that is definitely changing and has changed in a meaningful way. At the end of the day, why should it matter what the mechanism for delivering power to your car is if when you press the throttle down, it goes and it goes fast and it goes the way you want when you want it to go, whether that is turbocharged, naturally aspirated, supercharged, or even electric. Let's say that too. Now, the problem is those don't all have the same properties of power delivery, and that's what we use to differentiate our preferences, whether we like the way a turbo feels or a naturally aspirated engine feels or the electric engine, all that torque, right, instantly available. There are pros and cons to each of these. So it's a matter of, as the market makes these decisions sort of writ large, what the designs look like, what people buy, that will dictate what this looks like in the future. And as an enthusiast, as somebody who was brought up with that religion of there ain't no replacement for displacement, right? Like the bigger the engine, the naturally aspirated large engine is always going to be better. It's going to be more fun to drive. You know, you'd rather be in that 911 GT3 that revs really high and is naturally aspirated, potentially, than that 911 turbo dentist car. But the reality is the turbo is actually quite capable and faster than the GT3 in terms of power delivery in a straight line, right? Some of the other differences between those cars are more about handling and other characteristics. The differential between when you stomp on the gas and you get power is much less and much different than it used to be between the turbo and the supercharged cars. So it makes a lot harder choice for us.
Well, I think a big thing that you brought up there was saying feel. And so, what is the difference of an NA car, turbo, supercharged, or boosted versus non boosted? And it's the way that it feels. And not only the acceleration, the power delivery or the numbers that it can put on the ground, but the way that it sounds, the way,
Yeah.
linear versus a boost rolling in. Like, I think the feel is what really matters in this. And there is a major difference of driving an NA car versus a boosted car. And like you're saying, of like a GT3 versus an old turbo. Why is everyone, raving about the GT3? Why is everyone up in arms about the new GT3 being turbocharged? And they're saying
Right.
sacrilege. Well, why are enthusiasts so upset about this? And I think that there is something very analog and mechanical feeling about an NA car, a naturally aspirated car, comparative to a boosted car. And now, well, why? Why is a boosted car, what is taken away in that experience? And for me personally, I just think that turbos really mute the engine and
Mhm.
they are robbing the exhaust gas, which turns into boost, which means they sound a lot quieter. They
Yeah.
don't have a noise because a naturally aspirated engine delivers that exhaust right out the tailpipe and it makes a glorious noise. Where a turbo car, it just sounds like a vacuum cleaner.
Yeah, well, the noise on your car comes from really two places, three really, if you want to think about it. It comes from your intake, it comes from your exhaust, and then maybe it comes from your tires on the road, right? Or like aero wash or something like that. But like that's a major source of the experience we have in the car is how it sounds. That's the feedback we use to decide when to shift or whatever, right? So that sound is important to us. And what we're saying is that the turbo sound doesn't give us quite the same qualities that naturally aspirated sound gives us.
Well, but there's a major difference between old school turbos and new school turbos because in the modern day era, they're being really efficient with their turbos, which means you don't hear them. They're
Yeah.
tucked away. Like the wastegates don't blow. Like if you think about an old school JDM car, like you can hear it build boost, you can hear it, the blow off valve, all that sort of like there's excitement there, there's character there. Modern day turbo cars don't have that.
And non-turbo cars don't make that noise. So it's really an aesthetic preference. Like, do you like blow-off sounds? Do you like wastegate sounds, turbo sounds? Or do you like low rumble grumble sounds? And can you have both of those? Can they coexist?
Well, I think my argument of like modern cars is most of them don't have that character to them. Most turbo cars, modern day turbo cars, are not like flamboyantly advertising, hey, I'm turbocharged in the sense of you can hear everything happening.
Just the opposite, right? Again, back to that 911 turbo example as sort of like the canonical turbo car. They call that the dentist's car. They say the exhaust on it sounds like a vacuum cleaner or a sewing machine, depending on who you ask. And that's sort of canonical within the Porsche enthusiast community. That's the sense that like turbos just don't sound good. But we both know that that's not true because there are examples, production car examples, where turbos were made to sound amazing.
Yeah, but I think those are few and far between. I
They
think that's
are.
the problem. Well, and also the reason why turbos sound good is the inefficiencies of the old systems. When you become really efficient with the way that you use turbos, it dulls down the car. It makes it boring. Like and I think we've seen this when, most manufacturers started to make the transition of turbocharging their cars, which I think we would agree is kind of around that like 2010, 2015 era where we saw BMW going turbocharged with the M3s, Ferrari starting to turbocharge most of their flagship cars. A lot of these brands, stopped the whole chase for displacement in the sense of like add cylinders, make the engines bigger, make more power. It's like, then they finally found, okay, like if we just add turbos to stuff, we can drop cylinders and add turbos and make more power. In that transition, we saw a lot of cars lose their souls.
It's
You
true.
know, with the M3, I'm always going to go back to that. We saw the transition from the E90 with a naturally aspirated V8 to the F80, which then had the twin turbo inline six. It lost a lot of character. Like, yes, it was more powerful. Yes, it was faster. Yes, it was more lightweight. Yes, it was more fuel efficient. All of great things. But the feel of what it was gone. And now if we look at Ferraris, massive jump of just the sole experience of the car from the 458 naturally aspirated high revving V8 to the 488 turbocharged. It lost so much.
I
Like
think
it got neutered.
I think that's right. And there's terminology that car enthusiasts use that I've had people laugh at me when I said something about a car because they just didn't understand. I talked about a car and experience being raw. Like, what do you mean? Like, it's about the way the car delivers its power, the sounds the cars make when they're doing that, the experience you have behind the wheel and what you feel through the steering wheel, through the pedals, through the gear shifter. Those are all part of that experience and the
Yeah.
feel, whether your experience could be raw or neutered or numb or whatever you want to call it. And I think that's something that can be fairly elusive and hard to define. And as a proxy, we've mapped naturally aspirated onto raw. We've mapped turbo onto muted. That's just
Yeah.
how we
Yeah.
think about it today. But we both know cars that are exceptions to the rule on either side of those.
Right.
And so maybe it's that the technology of turbos is improving such that, yeah, back in the old days when they were super inefficient, single turbos, robbing exhaust gases to go, and that boost was very sudden, you didn't get any good sounds. You didn't get much experience or feel from the car other than things that seemed like disadvantages, like slow to accelerate and sudden overwhelming boost more than maybe you wanted. Versus today, you get on the gas and you get the power you want and it delivers it and it delivers it quickly with very little lag thanks to these additional systems and architectural changes that have been made.
See, and I might disagree of like I enjoy old school turbo cars versus modern day cars. And I think it's this weird overarching discussion of like have cars become too efficient? Because when I put my foot down, yes, a modern day car is going to be able to put the power down. It's going to be quick from 0 to 60, but it's not going to be an incredible experience. Like you drive a new G80 M3 and it's got, you know, an immense amount of power, but it just doesn't feel quick. It doesn't feel fast where like, and maybe this is the discussion of like analog cars and what does that actually mean? And like maybe analog just doesn't represent naturally aspirated, but like analog turbo cars, the old school turbos, like driving a turbo car from the 90s is an exciting experience because it's inefficient, because oh, I'm waiting for that boost. Boom, big slam, big power.
Yeah.
Where like nowadays it's just so efficient in its power delivery, you're kind of like boo, snore, like because this car can accelerate. And I think EVs are the ultimate example of this, of like they're ultimately efficient,
Yeah.
but ultimately boring. Okay, I floor a Tesla 5 times in a row. The first time it's like, wow, this is really exciting. Instant torque, it accelerates insanely quick. After the second or third time, I'd be like, okay, I'm bored. It's a one-trick pony. Like, yes, it can accelerate fast, but I'm not enjoying this experience. I'm not hearing an engine. I'm not waiting for something. There's no anticipation for, you know, the theatrics of anything. And I think modern day turbo cars kind of started to get encompassed with that of like, yeah, it's really good, but I'm bored.
Yeah, it's the lack of drama, right? And
Yes.
there
Yeah.
is drama when you're waiting for the boost and slam, that thing just hits you in the back and you now have the boost and you're going fast.
Yeah.
And maybe even a little out of control. And the sounds you're making are these whistling, popping sounds behind you and it sounds so good. But yeah, if it's done too well, right, we numb the experience, we sanitize it, we sterilize it. You make it to the point where like, get in a Tesla and stamp it on the gas. Like, you go fast, but it doesn't feel the way it would feel if you were in the equivalent of a really fast, naturally aspirated Corvette, stomping on the gas and going. The way the power is delivered, the sounds the car makes, the rate at which the acceleration and G-forces are going to push you back in the seat, the way the overall feel of the car is through the steering wheel, the vibrations you're going to get, just that whole experience is different.
I mean, there's beauty in inefficiencies, and we see this in art. If some painter was so perfect and could create a perfect representation of something, almost photographic, at what point does art become like, okay, it just looks like the thing? There's no flavor, there's no creativity, there's no, interpretation left to the viewer or to the driver of like, I want to experience this car in a different way. Now, a modern day car that is turbocharged that I do want to highlight that I think does encompass kind of these old school experiences of old school turbos is the GT2 RS.
Absolutely.
And I think a great comparison of those two cars, and we kind of made this comparison in a very older episode, but I want to bring it back because I think it is a great comparison.
Yeah.
The GT2 RS and the Ferrari 488 Pista both came out in the same era. And it was kind of this adding turbos to things, right? I know that the GT2 has always been a turbocharged GT3 essentially, right? But, the 488 used to be, the 458 used to be naturally aspirated, adding these turbos.
Yes.
Now, the Pista, which you think would be this like, oh yeah, it's going to be like this ultimate performance-oriented car, it lost luster for me because of its efficiencies with the turbos. It just, it was ungodly fast, but like the way that it fed the boost in and the way the turbo sounded, it was all very efficient. It wasn't dramatic, and I want a Ferrari to be dramatic. It's Italian. I want it to slap me across the face every once in a while. Like, that's the point of it. Where with the GT2 RS, you would imagine like, oh, German engineering, like this is going to be very like efficient and like delivered to you. But the GT2 RS, I think the engineers did a phenomenal job and added a lot of character to it. You can hear the turbos building boost. There's all these pops and bangs and crackles, very reminiscent of the old school turbo race cars of the era back in the 90s, like the 935s and stuff like that.
That's right.
Which I think they did take a lot from those cars and were like, let's try to make that into a modern day rendition. And so there is a lot of character in that car, and there is a lot to be excited about in that car. And in the turbos, I think, add a lot to that experience, but there's not a lot of turbocharged cars that are like that, and that car brings a premium, and I think it's because it can deliver that sort of experience.
It's kind of a smooth versus rough. Like they can both exist, but it's just different ways of delivering it. And the Pista was very smooth, right? It just had that capability of, it just continued to deliver the power in such a clean way. It just felt like it would keep coming. But in the GT2 RS, it's a little messier. It's a little grittier. You hear the grinding of the gears. You hear the chatter of the flywheel. You hear the turbos making all kinds of noises and those pops. And it does sound a little bit more organic versus an electronic experience. And the exhaust note is something else we should mention. Both of the Pista and the GT2 RS, they've figured out quite a bit how to make a turbo engine exhaust note sound pretty good. The 488 was okay if you really got on it in like track mode. You had to turn everything off a certain way. The GT2 RS out of the box sounds pretty mean and guttural and low and grumbly, things that we do not associate with most turbos and certainly not most 911 turbos.
Right. And I mean, like the 488, I don't think they could have done anything to make it sound better than a 458. I think they were screwed in that situation. And like that is a prime example of like turbos just ruining stuff. And so I think my main gripe, and I am team naturally aspirated. Like,
tell me about your license plate, Sylas.
I mean, I own an E90 M3 for a reason with the license plate last NA M3, because after that they went to turbos. And I think it is something to herald of like, this last just like raw engine, that there is no artificial, jamming of air, and there's nothing that takes away from the mechanical prowess of that motor. And I think that's a big deal. And there's a lot of character in that. And I think that's the biggest thing that I have with modern day turbos is they don't have character. They're too efficient, they're too engineer based, and this is not me to be like, we need to stop innovating. Like, don't go further down the rabbit hole. But it's like, I think that there is a piece in enjoying something that you go so far in innovation that it ruins the art experience of the item. And like, maybe even in photography, we can think about modern day of like, there used to be an art to photography, film photography, even like early day digital. But nowadays we've gone so far with the development of this technology, we have it in our pocket and we have cell phones. So it's like, why do you even need a professional photographer? Because we all are, because we have all this technology. So it's the same thing with cars of like, there used to be something so like personable about driving your car and the experience that it gave you. And now it's like, everything's fast, everything's efficient, everyone can drive quickly. Like someone in a Tesla can drive like an idiot, where back in the day, it used to just be like those people that had enthusiast cars that could do it.
There's a quote that seems so appropriate here by this guy named Andre Gide. He said, art requires resistance in the material. right? If it's easy, if it can deliver itself naturally, it's not art. It's just there, it just exists. But it's the thing that makes it a little bit more difficult to achieve. The rubbing of one thing against another with some friction being created, the combining of forces that don't necessarily all go together and they create something maybe unexpected or different, right? That's what makes this special experience. And if you think about the naturally aspirated engine, one of the things that gets called out is high rev range, right?
Yeah.
Generally, turbos redline out a lot lower than a naturally aspirated engine. So the howl of the engine, the sound of a car that's revving high at 8, 9, 10,000 RPMs sounds fierce, sounds like a battle cry. It sounds like banshees. We use all these descriptions, this language that's about the howl of a high-strung engine. Nobody talks about the nice quiet of the like well-mannered, fast-delivering and efficient turbo engine in that same way, unless it's for the luxury product, the quiet experience on the road, not for the enthusiast experience where we're trying to get something out of this driving experience and really feel the car and what it's about. And knowing that it's at tension means it's trying really hard to do this thing. We're one together, human and machine working together, and there's this effort being applied. And when the turbos are there doing it and you don't feel the effort, there's something missing, right? And I think not hearing the effort that the car is making in working hard to deliver the power robs something from the experience. Imagine no sound in a car. I once over sound dampened one of my cars, like put in that Dynamat material inside, and I couldn't hear outside, and I never knew when to shift. Like, sure, I could watch the RPMs on the tach, but that's not how I do it. I didn't realize how important that sound was. And so being able to hear the car tell you what it's doing, respond to you and the road and the environment is such an important part of the enthusiast experience. I think that's what gets trapped up in this discussion of turbo versus NA, supercharger or not. Really, it's about how do we get the most feeling out of our experience driving a car, and what are the things that light us up, and maybe it's just different for different people.
Right. And I think that's like another thing to recognize of being an enthusiast of cars isn't being excited about numbers on a paper or performance. And
Yeah.
I think we've really gotten to this stage in automobiles that, going faster isn't necessarily what we're looking for. Like cars are kind of, in a way, I don't want to say fast enough because we always want more, right? But like if we start losing out on, and we know that the most efficient way to make a car faster is everything's electric, we're losing a majority of what makes cars fun,
And there's
right?
diminishing returns, right? I mean, cars have gotten stupid fast, right? The feeling of difference between cars that took 5 seconds to go 0 to 60 and 3 seconds, that's dramatic. 5 seconds to 7 seconds, that was dramatic. These are things that happen over time through the evolution of engine, power, technology, what have you. But now we're in this place today where it can only get so much better, right? The improvements that they're making, you can't even feel, right? The generations successive of 911 turbos used to be a benchmark for how fast cars were. When they were 4 seconds, nothing else out there was faster than 6. Then they got into the 3s, then they got into the high 2s, now they're in the mid 2s. There's not that much further to do. Like, even if it could be faster, you can't perceive the difference.
Right.
So what's the point?
So with all of this, I ask you the question of like, I think the prime example where enthusiasts feel like they're losing out on something that's going turbo is with the next generation GT3 RS. And
Right.
I think from my perspective, my opinion is if Porsche is going to turbo it, call it something different. Like let the GT3 RS be what it's always represented and be this high revving, naturally aspirated, motorsport focused car. And that's the thing is like within motorsports, for the most part, for the longest time, we always saw that the race cars were naturally aspirated, that they developed the engines naturally aspirated because a linear power delivery is really good on the track. Now, as turbos have gotten more efficient, we've seen more turbocharged race cars within GT3, GT4, all the racing categories,
Right.
all the way up to the prototypes having turbos, hybrids, whatever. But, with this vehicle now going turbo, like, are we losing what the GT3 represented? Is it like, does it not matter? Do you not care? Like, what's your
Yeah.
opinion on the whole basis?
I mean, to the extent that GT3 racing today are mostly naturally aspirated race cars, but there are some turbos among the field, right?
Right.
So that's the direction this is going. Motorsports drives this. Paddle shifting was a default in race cars well before it was in street cars, even though most people drive automatic cars. because we wanted that capability to still shift, but we realized we came up with this new thing that was faster than the H pattern shifting.
Yeah.
And all of us old enthusiasts, manual transmission bigots, loved the old H pattern because it was fun and engaging. It wasn't faster anymore. So we
Yeah.
had to give that up. It used to be that manual transmissions were faster. Like if you look at the 0 to 60 specs in old Car and Driver, Road and Track, the manual transmission versions were faster than the automatics. But when PDK and dual clutch transmissions got good enough, that was no longer the case. And now race cars use paddles, not manual shifters, because they're faster. So race cars are going to continue to use whatever's faster. And if that's turbos, they'll use turbos. If that's EV plus turbos, they'll do that to the extent that they don't ruin the product. And that's a different discussion to be had about whether electric engine-based racing is going to be the same as what we've seen in the past with combustion. I guess F1 is a huge test of that this year.
I think that's an interesting thing that you bring up of like this concept of technology advances, things go a certain way. Manual transmission kind of got phased out of racing and motorsports, which
Yes.
like as enthusiasts, we always look at motorsports to be like, yeah, that's the cream of the crop. Like we all want to have a race car for the street, or so we think, like we've talked about. But this whole thing that we've grabbed onto manual transmissions as enthusiasts and, die on the hill of three pedals. And is the naturally aspirated engine kind of going to go to that wayside where like enthusiasts, myself included, are going to hold on to the hill to be like, oh, nothing drives like an NA car does in that just raw power experience. But it is going to be one of those things that like, hey, that's just outdated. Like manufacturers aren't going to make NA motors anymore because it makes no sense. It takes very little for them nowadays to just add turbos and make things more efficient, make them more powerful. They're never going to go back to the way of NA unless you're going to get charged over $1 million, which we've seen with naturally aspirated V12s, V10s, stuff like that on like the upper oosh of like hypercars nowadays, because they know that engine is something special, but it's not the most efficient, it's not the most economical, it's not the most environmentally friendly. And so like the NA engine is kind of not the answer for a lot of things anymore.
Well, we as enthusiasts talk about engagement in driving, right? And some of these decisions we've made about whether we like naturally aspirated or turbos or front-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive is about the feeling, the engagement when driving.
There's nothing that stops you from buying an H pattern car or an NA car, or like these cars still exist. It's just unfortunate that the momentum of the industry is not going to produce more of them, that they're going to become fewer and far between. And it is going to be one of those things of it is old technology. And if you want one of those cars, you have to look back a handful of years, maybe a decade, to find the one that you want and get that experience. And this is why cars become collectible. This is why cars go up in value, is that they're no longer produced the way that they used to be produced. And if you want that one car, well, now it's only limited to the old ones that have survived the test of time.
Yeah, this is just the direction and the way things are going, right? We can either accept it or fight it. Maybe we can do both of those things. I daily drive 1 or 2 turbo cars, and I was really feeling like I wanted that experience of the old analog feel. I get that from one of my cars because it's old.
Right, you have an old turbo and a new turbo.
I have an old turbo and a new turbo. But when I was out seeking an additional car to add to the fleet, I found a 2003 BMW M5 naturally aspirated V8 with a stick shift H pattern.
So we can have it all. I mean, as enthusiasts, I think that's something that we shouldn't lose sight of, is we have options. Well, this has been a fun dive of NA versus turbos. I think I'm still going to die on my NA hill. I mean, I'm just going to cherish my cars and realize that that era might be behind us, and the last few standing NA cars that are out there, if you want one, go get them now before everything goes fully turbo.
I want to embrace the improvements in technology, but I also want to hold on to that type of experience that I've really enjoyed in the past, and I want to continue to have. So I think it's a matter of taking advantage of the new technological developments where they serve you well. Don't let your biases or bigotry about NA versus turbo or whatever it is get in the way of you actually having a fun time in your car. And maybe it's worth every once in a while reevaluating your opinions about those things, because the technology does develop and stuff changes. And maybe you wouldn't expect to be looking for an actively slower, harder to drive, higher upkeep vehicle. But for the experience that you want to get and the enjoyment you get out of driving, that's really what you want. There's nothing wrong with that. Go get that single turbo. Get that single clutch that's going to kick you in the back every time you pull a shift. and enjoy that experience because you can't get that out of very many cars on the road today. So that's what this is about, maintaining something that used to exist, highlighting what about it was special, what's different now, what's evolved, and updating our own points of view to make sure that we're not just kind of stuck in the past.
Well, it's been a great conversation. Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Sylas.
And thanks for listening. This has been Cold Start.